This video will cover part 1 of Chapter 5, Psychology and the Law for PSY 120, Careers in Psychology, Neuroscience, and Human Development. In this chapter, we'll look at one of the areas of psychology that is possibly the most misunderstood, in part because of pop culture and media representations of what people in this space do. I can quite clearly remember when profiling the idea that people with a psychology or psychiatry background would be engaged actively in the pursuit of people who do very bad things. That started to hit really hard in the 1990s in the media, in movies like Silence of the Lambs and later TV shows and so on. That led to a lot of misunderstanding about the role of psychology and psychiatry, indeed mental health, in the whole world of law enforcement, the legal system, and so on. So part of what I'll be doing in this part 1 of the presentation is kind of debunking some of that mythology to ground you more solidly in what psychology and law is all about. We'll start with legal psychology, and that term has been used in the last couple of decades to refer very broadly to the intersections and connections between the various fields that make up psychology and then the various aspects of that thing that we call the law. And what I found interesting as a graduate student in this area, because my degree is in social and personality psychology, but I got a minor specialization in psychology and the law during my graduate training. I was surprised during my education just how many ways in which psychology and neuroscience and all of the research in those areas, in fact, is woven into the fabric of the legal system and more broadly the concept of the law. So specifically, legal psychology refers to applying psychological ideas, theories, principles to understand the legal system and systems that are built within it. And that can be, in a lot of different contexts, not just in criminal law, but in other areas of law as well. Legal psychology is very, very broad, and psychologists trained in a lot of different subdisciplines can be involved in this kind of work. For example, when I was taking cognitive psychology as a graduate student, my professor was engaged in as an expert witness in litigation on a car crash. And I was thinking at the time, wow, why is a cognitive psychologist involved in this case? In addition to cognition, this particular professor also did research in sensation and perception and the way people make sense of what they see and hear. He was being brought in as an expert witness to talk about both memory for events, but also what could people legitimately be expected to perceive at that time of day under those environmental circumstances. And he was called upon to do simulations and replications. Now, that's a very far removed from what people think about as psychology being involved in the law based on media representations, which involve, gun-toting, super attractive profilers on shows like Criminal Minds. So I want you first to think about just how broad the applications are for psychology in the law. There are lots of research topics that we could explore. If you were interested in legal psychology, I was just describing an example where the professor that I had for cognitive psychology was an expert witness talking about, in part, memory. But many experts from cognitive psychology have done work as researchers on eyewitness testimony and memory, suggestibility. On the clinical side, there are lots of decisions that have to be made about determining whether people are competent cognitively, psychologically to control their own affairs, like making financial decisions, medical decisions, and so on. There's a lot of social psychology research done to understand how jurors make decisions, how they negotiate with each other, how differences in their own cognitive styles impact their decision making, how their attitudes, values, and beliefs impact their decision making. Media portrayals, and generally speaking, the attitudes that people have about the legal system becomes a research question when you have a significant proportion of the population distrustful of legal institutions. We've certainly seen a lot of that in recent years. Psychology is also involved in issues related to child welfare, child custody, adoption, parental fitness, and so on. So research has been done in all of these areas by psychologists. In some cases, you'll have psychologists giving expert testimony in cases. In other situations, you'll have clinicians doing assessments and making reports to the court. In the child protection welfare area, assessment has to be done in terms of determining whether or not maltreatment has occurred. If it has occurred, what kind of impacts has it had? Reports need to be made as to the court as to what kind of decisions may be the best for children involved in such situations. There's also the clinical work of working with traumatized children in the court system. And, that's a very complicated set of issues. Now, forensic psychology is probably the closest to the media presentation we have of quote-unquote profilers. Forensic psychology is a professional specialization. It's typically a specialization pursued by clinical psychologists who get all of their clinical psychology training and then specialize in forensic psychology. So their focus is on working with individuals who are involved with the legal system. So this is a narrow area of application. It is a mental health discipline. As I said, it's usually an offshoot of clinical psychology, where individuals, defendants, victims, witnesses, anyone who's involved with the legal system, it may be someone who runs into or works with a forensic psychologist. Notice that the forensic psychologist is not a law enforcement officer. So unlike the media representation, you're not going to have a forensic psychologist who spends their day chasing down serial murderers, nor will you have kind of like the Law and Order model of a psychologist or psychiatrist who kind of hangs out in the station house and provides detectives with an on-the-spot profile of who they're looking for. That's just really not a thing that actually happens. Forensic psychologists are typically clinical counseling psychologists. They work in the system. Sometimes they work in forensic mental health units, so that could be in a hospital setting, in an inpatient setting, or in jails and prisons, where you have people with mental health diagnoses, mental illnesses, and or addiction. And the forensically trained clinician is going to be providing services, assessment, as well as treatment provision. And these individuals, if they are PhD holders, may also be providing supervision of master's level clinicians as well. They can also be found in delivering court-related services such as reports, assessments when called upon. Sometimes they are called upon by the court to produce reports. Sometimes they are hired independently to produce assessments and reports and so on. lot of different research topics in forensic. People who are really interested in criminal behavior tend to gravitate toward forensic psychology, particularly if they see themselves in the future providing treatment and assessment services to that population. There's a lot of interest in conducting mental health evaluations, determining factors that are related to all kinds of things. So these are individuals who do competency assessments. So are you competent to understand the legal proceedings that you're involved in? There also can be involved in doing assessments to determine whether or not a person's mental state at the time of a particular event would have impacted their decision making. Forensic psychologists can also be interested in victim impacts and therapeutic services for victims, support programs for victims, and providing support for people who are being asked after they are traumatized to provide testimony. Many forensic psychologists are heavily involved in treatment and rehabilitation, and that involves providing evidence-based treatment and rehabilitation services to those individuals. So there's a lot of research going on behind the scenes to talk about what kind of treatment approaches work, what kind of rehab programs actually work to turn people around so that they are no longer offending. Research has also been done in terms of resilience and coping. A lot of that has to do with trauma victims. And if you really think about, people who offend, people who commit crimes, often, I can't give you exact statistics, but they routinely have a trauma history themselves. So whether you're working with offenders or with victims of crime, there's a lot of research interest in how to move people in a positive direction post-trauma. And then a lot of research interest in finding ways to identify, to reduce impacts of implicit bias in forensic evaluation. So, for example, a researcher may want to know what's the impact of certain demographic characteristics like race, ethnicity, physical appearance, all kinds of factors like that. How does that impact the way people are evaluated as offenders, the way people are evaluated as victims? So lots of different research topics there. Now, police psychology is its own kind of particular niche. And what you're talking about here is the psychological aspects of being a person engaged in law enforcement. Obviously, current events, things that are going on in our culture at the moment, there are a lot of issues here for the psychological welfare and well-being of people who are engaged in law enforcement. There are a lot of pressures there, and there always have been. Police work is not easy. It's difficult, and police psychologists play a role in helping to identify people who are good candidates for work in law enforcement. And sometimes police psychologists are more broadly defined as psychologists who work with first responders, not just police. But the global kind of title here of police psychology has tended to stick. But a lot of these folks will work with first responders of other kinds as well. These are individuals who are licensed mental health practitioners. They typically have a background in clinical or counseling psychology. Rarely, although it's possible, they could have training in psychiatry, which is a medical specialty. These are individuals who do a lot of assessment and clinical interventions in law enforcement settings, but they don't do that thing that you see on TV of hanging out with detectives and providing them with on-the-spot profiling. That's just not what they do. They do hiring assessments. So if a person applies to be an officer after training at a department, they may do assessments before employment. if they're applying to a police academy, they will undergo assessments. And so the clinical counseling psychologists who work in that role of doing those assessments prior to becoming an officer are police psychologists. They will also be contracted with police departments, sheriff's departments, to do fitness for duty evaluations. So if a person has had a traumatic experience as a first responder, they may be required to work with the police psychologist before they can return to duty. So let's say that a police officer or a firefighter has been injured in the line of duty. Before they can come back, they have to pass an assessment and get kind of the approval of the psychologist before they can go forward. Police psychologists may be engaged after major incidents to help officers to contextualize what has occurred, to help them make sense of what's happened, to evaluate their ability to turn to work, and so on. Sometimes the police psychologist will be delivering therapy and other kinds of services. It really just depends on the size of the police department. The larger the department, the more likely they're going to have their own police psychologists on staff. The smaller the department, the more likely they're going to contract out for that kind of work. Some police psychologists do specialize in what's called operational support. So they may work with law enforcement agencies to develop good strategies for interacting with the public. They may give advice about communication strategies and so on. This is an area that's very niche. It's very specialized, and it's not necessarily going to be a clinical or counseling psychologist who does this. But, again, it really depends on the size of the agency, the size of the police department, and the resources of that particular department to have such a specialized individual. Rarely will you have a police psychologist who is called in to do negotiation. So let's say you have a hostage situation in the media, in television and film. It's often assumed that the person who does the negotiating is a psychologist. That's a rarity. It's usually a law enforcement officer who has specialized training in doing negotiation in critical incidents. So more often that job is a cop's job as opposed to being a psychologist's job. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in the media about that. Now, a lot of different research topics. I had a classmate when I was in graduate school who very clearly from day one wanted to go into police psychology. She wanted to do research in this area and then work professionally in this area. And one of her areas of interest was what kind of personality and behavioral characteristics make for the most effective officers, and what kind of professional development opportunities can we give officers to make them more effective in the work that they do. Another research area is crisis intervention approaches. Certainly there's a lot of desire to create procedures and protocols when you're dealing with these really dangerous kinds of situations. And police officers often say that the most dangerous situations for them to walk into are situations in people's homes where you have a person who's in crisis, who may represent a danger to self or others, and how do you manage that situation so that you can mitigate damage and help prevent anyone from getting hurt. Now that involves teaching police officers and other first responders how to do solid crisis intervention to de-escalate those kinds of situations to avoid people getting injured. A lot of research by police psychologists looking at stress and burnout, also trauma responders in police and other kinds of first responders. In a research area that kind of overlaps with cognitive and social psychology, you have research on decision making, how decisions are made, how effective de-escalation technique can be used, and which kinds of techniques work the best. This is also an area where you have some overlaps. So I had classmates, for instance, who were professionally, they were clinical psychology students and they wanted to go into police psychology, but they were doing research with people like me, social psychologists, to compare the effectiveness of various interrogation techniques. So we had some researchers in my grad program who were using, an undergraduate population and testing whether or not particular types of techniques of questionings were more likely to elicit false confessions. And that's fascinating research. And then finally, what are the impacts of implicit bias? So if you have implicit, meaning biases you're unaware of, implicit biases about potential offenders and what they're doing, how can that be minimized? How can it be identified and then combated? Correctional psychology is specifically clinical and counseling psychology as applied to prisons and jails and other correctional settings. So given that in our culture, we have high incarceration rates, also within our incarcerated populations, we have a high percentage of individuals who have at least one mental health diagnosis and may also have an addiction issue or a substance use issue as well. What that means is those are people who are going to require mental health services. They're going to require assessment, they're going to require diagnostics, they're going to require care and supervision. So what do correctional psychologists do? They do assessments, write reports, they provide treatment plans, deliver treatments, and so on. If you're talking about a correctional psychologist who's doctoral level, more likely they are going to be supervisory, and the master's level individuals are going to be delivering therapeutic services directly to inmates and individuals in other correctional settings. Correctional psychologists may be involved in creating, putting into place, and evaluating programs. And these can be programs of many different kinds, like managing behaviors, skill development, interventions that are related to rehabilitation, and keeping people from reoffending. They also work to maintain well-being, and that can be the inmates, but also staff and people who work in the correctional setting. Correctional institutions can be high-stress workplaces, and definitely from the inmate standpoint, they can be high-stress living spaces as well. So part of what correctional psychologists do is to provide recommendations and suggestions for how to manage those kinds of stress-related risks. Some research topics, and I had other classmates when I was in grad school who were really interested in providing mental health services in correctional settings. Lots of research into what kind of mental health disorders inmates tend to have and what kind of treatment protocols work the best for them, what kind of challenges do staff have, what kind of interventions tend to work best for them. A real big buzz phrase in recent years has been using trauma-informed care, because offenders, people who break the law, a very high percentage of the time have a clearly documented trauma history. So being trauma-informed in the work that you do in that space is particularly important. So right now, there's a lot of research going on to look at the impacts of trauma-informed protocols. Some researchers in this area are interested in how to increase the likelihood that people will be successful in their reintegration after release from jail or prison. There's a lot of research going on about reducing violence and conflict in correctional spaces. Some researchers are interested in, just the impacts of the environments themselves. So, prisons and jails in the United States vary tremendously from one location to another. They vary in terms of how well funded they are, whether they're private or publicly funded, and so on. So researchers want to look at things like the characteristics of the prison environment and how does that relate to inmate violations, conflicts among inmates, conflicts between staff and inmates, and so on. So that's an important area of research. And then finally, the effects of access to educational programs on well-being and rehab goals for keeping people from violating the rules of their incarceration while they are incarcerated, and helping them to achieve educational goals that will make them more likely to be successful after they are released from jail or prison. And that concludes part 1 of Chapter 5.